First, I'd like to welcome the Honorable Kirsten Hillman, Ambassador of Canada to the United States. The Honorable Juan Gabriel Valdés, Ambassador of the Republic of Chile to the United States. Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, appreciate it. The Honorable Ana Michelle Asimakopolou, thank you so much. Member of the European Parliament and Vice Chair of the European Parliament's Committee on International Trade. Thank you so much for joining me. And Satoshi Nohara, Director General of Commerce and Information Policy Bureau at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry for Japan. Thank you. So thank you all for being here. We've heard a really fascinating discussion so far with this panel, with this event of how the race toward cleaner cars and sources of energy is transforming economic and geopolitical relations between countries. So I'm delighted to have such a distinguished and interesting group here to discuss these issues. Ambassador Hillman, I'd like to start with you. President Biden just made a visit to Canada last week, and I understand that critical minerals were one topic of discussion. Could you tell us more about that conversation and what the North American vision is for the critical minerals supply chain? Canada does have some significant sources of critical minerals, but I understand that the country is not interested in being purely a raw minerals exporter. So how do you envision that supply chain evolving, and what kind of concrete policies do you need to get there?
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for having us. This is going to be a good conversation with colleagues here. Yeah, indeed, President Biden was in Canada for a couple of days last week, and the overall thematic of the visit was energy security, environmental policy, and national security, and sort of how they intertwine. And in that regard, one of the big outcomes of our discussion was how we work together on critical minerals. So we've been doing that for about over 2 years, since the Biden administration came in and a little bit before that, mapping our region, what minerals we have, what vulnerabilities we have, where we are sufficiently independent, where we are not. Frankly, in most areas, you know, there's work to be done. And then moving on to deciding how we best use our resources, and I mean here financial government resources, to incentivize further investment in order to address our strategic vulnerabilities. Not only our domestic strategic vulnerabilities, but our vulnerabilities in the community of allies. So for us in the US and in the context of last week's visit, that was very much the focus. But our allies, of course, go beyond that, and we have partnerships with Japan and the UK and the EU as well. And I think that here, a very important outcome from my perspective of this discussion between our leaders was the recognition that we would be deploying our government resources in a complementary way where we could, and that we would be discussing how to make sure that we weren't sort of undercutting each other, but on the contrary, deploying those resources in a way that furthered our joint ability to move as quickly as we can to independence among allies in the critical mineral space. And that includes mining, of course. Canada has 30 critical minerals. We're prioritizing 6 right now. But it also includes all of the upstream work, as you mentioned, in both countries, where it makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm. And the US and Canadian auto supply chains are historically very integrated. So how do you see that developing for electric vehicles?
Well, for vehicles, I mean, I think that we have had a deeply integrated, since the 70s, deeply integrated vehicle supply chain, and the vision is to continue that through the electrification of the transportation system, and that was recognized in the IRA, as people may know. So I don't think that's going to change, and I think we're only going to continue to build on that strength. I mean, in Canada, we have, when we manufacture a vehicle in sort of the Michigan-Ontario zone, manufacturing zone, the vehicle tends to cross the border about 8 or 9 times before it's finally assembled, and that has created efficiencies that we value and that we're going to take forward into the electrification. But beyond that, we have mining and processing facilities that we're going to seek to expand for cobalt, for rare earths. The Premier of Saskatchewan's here. They're doing some really interesting things on rare earths there. And the customers are in the United States. They're elsewhere as well, but they're also in the United States. So mining, upstream activities, and then, frankly, as a mining nation, we have the expertise, we have the people, we have the long history for being able to propel this sector forward at a time where, let's face it, demand is outstripping supply by a long shot. And so we're really working on the human element of that between Canada and the United States as well.
Ambassador Valdés, Chile is also very blessed with a supply of critical minerals, particularly lithium. Can you speak to us about the economics of lithium extraction in your country, and what role do you see foreign investment and trade agreements in determining where this material is ultimately delivered globally?
Well, yes. In fact, Chile has some 40 or 44% of the reserves of lithium. And along with Bolivia and Argentina, we managed to have 65% of the reserves in the world. Chile has been working on lithium for years. We have an American company there, Albemarle, that has been producing lithium for years, and a Chilean company too. But the point is that both the previous government and this government have been working on a policy towards the production of lithium, and this policy has not yet been announced. It will be announced in 1 week or in 2 weeks. But what we know, because the president said it yesterday, is that it will maintain the property of the state over the salars or the deposits of lithium, but it will invite foreign capital to invest in lithium and in other areas like green hydrogen, in which we are also very hopeful, given the prices with which we could produce green hydrogen. The lithium production in Chile is blessed by the fact that we produce lithium at a cheaper price than our competitors, at a better price than our competitors. And therefore we have already seen that there is a lot of interest in the production of lithium and in the investments on lithium in Chile. Therefore, the main message is yes, we want American, Canadian, and Western investments in Chile in the lithium industry. We have an excellent trade relationship with China, which is our main trade partner, but we want our strategic minerals and our strategic development to be associated with countries with which we share values and we share a long history together. This is what I could answer.
Okay, great. Vice Chair Asimakopolou, I wanted to ask you about the Inflation Reduction Act, which has ruffled a lot of feathers in the European Union. The United States and the European Union are negotiating this deal over critical minerals now that will apparently address some of these concerns and allow European companies to participate in some of the benefits. But do you think more needs to be done to bridge the gap between American and European approaches in general when we talk about clean energy and cleaner cars?
First of all, thank you. I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad the European Union is represented. I was actually yesterday at the dinner listening to these wonderful people speak. I didn't even hear Europe mentioned. I was getting a little worried about that because we do, after all, Europe and the United States do have a very important relationship. We are each other's greatest trading partners. So, and here I'm glad that I saw some representatives. Well, they might not be the European Union, but it was Norway. So at least we're part of this conversation. You said it ruffled some feathers. Yeah, I guess it did. But, you know, our relationship is about so much more. And it's actually, for me, very encouraging that the European Union has now realized the importance of the critical raw materials and put it up so high on its agenda geostrategically. And the visit recently of Ursula von der Leyen and her discussion with President Biden, I think, is a very encouraging sign that we might find ways to work together. We already have strategic partnerships with Canada, we're working on an FTA with Chile, and lithium is, of course, part of this conversation. It's very important, and I think that this partnership that has been announced will go a long way toward unifying our approaches, our environmentally sound approaches, our sustainable approaches, our resilience approaches to supply chains. The last thing we want, and I hear the noise made by Congress, and I watched the question that you asked previously. You know, we don't want to get into a nasty subsidy race. I'm not saying that I don't understand that $369 billion is a ton of money, and you know, and I can tell the Europeans and the European Union, if we can't beat them, join them, because that makes most sense. But at the same time, the US also has been much more open about the elephant in the room, as we call it in Brussels, which is China. And you know, the European Union has now realized that these strategic dependencies we have on China are very worrying and very troubling, especially after Ukraine. I mean, we don't want to substitute one dependency on Russian gas for another one. And so that's why we have this Critical Raw Materials Act now, which is a very important piece of legislation. Maybe not, we're not a federation, as you know, so we can't do what the US does, but it's a very important moment for the European Union to push forward with this issue on the agenda. So I'm very hopeful that we'll make some concrete progress with the US on this, and that this will be another fortification of our already important relationship.
I did want to ask you about attitudes toward China. It seems like there is still some daylight between the United States and Europe in general when it comes to those approaches and postures toward China. Can you talk about how that dialogue within Europe, you know, how you see that developing Europe's relationship with China? And do you think, you know, Europe is trending more toward the US position these days, or will there still be some basic differences in approaches?
Well, look, I mean, we have an approach toward China which is difficult, I think, for an outsider to comprehend. You know, at the same time, we're a partner and we're a strategic rival and we're competitors. So it's a complicated relationship. We also do have, it's an important business relationship. There are interests, and many of our companies have interests in China. And you know, the way we talk about it in the Brussels bubble, where I live for the past few years, is, you know, we say, well, we don't want to decouple from China. What we want to do is de-risk our relationship. You know, I'm not so sure these are not just pretty words, but I do think that there is, you know, the Critical Raw Materials Act, for example, has targets. And one of the targets is that we can't be dependent for more than 65% of a critical raw material from a single source. Well, I mean, you know, that's photographic of China. There's not hardly anybody else we're dependent for more than 65% on one source. So, so the answer is that I think that we're moving in a direction where, whether you want to call it decoupling or de-risking, or whatever you want to call it, I think that we're becoming a lot more conscious in the European Union that our relationship with China has to be much clearer, and I think that we're coming together with the US on that position a lot more, and critical raw materials is a big part of that discussion, and a big reason for the IRA to include us as one of these partners that have free trade agreement preferential status.
Great. Mr. Nohara, I've been writing a lot about the US-Japan in the last 24 hours, so I'm excited to speak with you today. This kind of limited deal on critical raw materials between the United States and Japan was announced late last night in the United States. I was curious if you had any thoughts to share on what that agreement will look like, or what the implementation of it will look like. And do you think it's powerful enough to influence how critical mineral supply chains are organized globally? And more generally, how should countries think about breaking free from dependence on specific countries like China in battery supply chains?
Yeah, I'm very pleased to announce US and Japan agreement on strengthening critical mineral supply chain. Only a couple of hours ago, US Trade Representative and Japanese Ambassador Tomita just signed the agreement. So this is a really important step to develop U.S.-Japan battery partnership. 2 weeks ago, I visited Canada, Toronto and Montreal, with 16 Japanese battery cell makers, parts makers, trading corporations, and as battery mission, which Prime Minister Todo and Prime Minister Kishida discussed at the Canada-Japan Summit in January. So we met Industrial Minister Champagne and Resource Minister Wilkinson at the time. And also we had a discussion with the government officials of Canadian government and Ontario government and the Quebec government, how we can develop our partnership with Canada. So last year, we crafted a new battery strategy of Japan. And now we are urging Japanese battery suppliers, cell parts and material suppliers to invest globally to fulfill our responsibilities to supply battery parts, cells to like-minded countries, regions, markets. So regarding your questions, the last point, so regarding the kind of weakness of our supply chain, battery supply chains, the weakness exists in the upstream, as you know, and also the smelting process. So we are now very heavily rely on dependency on specific countries. So we need to diversify the procurement. So among like-minded countries and regions. So this summit is very timely. So this is what I want. So I'm here today. So thank you.
Great, thank you. We hear a lot about, policymakers talk a lot about this global race to the top, but that is very difficult in practice, I think, to create. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on how countries can work together to encourage kind of more responsible production or benefit their communities and the environment. And in particular, if there are any sort of partnerships that are working for your country right now. We heard a bit about the U.S. perspective from the Undersecretary previously, but I'd be curious what sort of partnerships each of you are looking at in your own countries that you see as kind of the most effective model that maybe you can develop and then maybe export as well. So Ambassador Hillman, do you want to
Sure.
talk about that?
I'd be happy to talk about that. I think the first thing to say is that we got ourselves into this position of dependency on primarily one supplier by perhaps a bit of inattention to the fact that there was this consolidation of production and most specifically processing, inattention to that fact that happened in a country that perhaps wasn't always going to be as reliable as we wanted, maybe not. COVID pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine really galvanized, I think, both the private and the public sector's minds around the risks of those kinds of strategic concentrations, or the concentration on strategic products like that. Mm-hmm. But one of the reasons that it happened was because it is challenging to mine and process these products in an environmentally sustainable way, and in a way that is respectful of the communities in which these products are often found. And so again, we kind of turned a bit of a blind eye to the fact that it didn't mean it's any less difficult in other countries. It just may mean that they have different standards than we do, and standards that we may find unacceptable if they're applying in our countries or if they're being undertaken by our companies. And so there's this sort of convergence of, I think, realizations that are happening right now. There's the serious and real security vulnerability, energy security, and hardcore security vulnerability of not having access to these products that are required for transportation, but also for defense applications and others. And then there's the recognition that increasingly governments and consumers who are interested in ensuring a green transition, who are interested in ensuring respect for human rights and labor rights and indigenous people and their, empowerment in these situations, are saying, well, wait a minute, we want that in our products. And so, long way to kind of come around to your question, which is I think governments have a role to play, private sector has a role to play, consumers have a role to play. It's for the governments to talk about the standards that we hold ourselves to in our societies, and to work with like-minded partners, all of whom are on this stage here today, around defining what those standards are and trying to come to a common understanding of that. And then use those standards to change the incentive structure, right? So the incentive isn't to skirt the standards, but governments have some tools to offer risks or offer, disincentives to not following the standards. I think that that's something we need to be talking about. It's starting, but I think there's a lot further we could go in that area. In terms of Canadian examples, this is one. There's many, but one that I'm really quite happy with and I'm exposed to a little bit more and more every day. And I did mention this last night, so apologize for those, but it really does move me. There's an organization in Canada called the First Nations Major Project Coalition, and it is an organization that works with Canadian First Nations, so Indigenous nations, that are interested in changing kind of the relationship that they have had, in particular to energy projects, major energy products, oil and gas, but also hydrogen and also mining and other. And what they do is they work with the communities to essentially empower them to be real partners at the table for two reasons, many probably, but the two that strike me are in order to have real negotiating ability for equity stakes in the project so that the communities can be sure that they reap the benefits economically on a long-term basis of the projects that are happening on their territories. And that they're really negotiating. They're not taking what is given to them, but they're saying, no, this is what we want from this deal. And I think that really makes a difference in a lot of ways, but in a very practical sense, in helping the projects perhaps move along more quickly than they might otherwise. But they're also bringing, it's not just about money, it's also about their community, what their community needs, the environmental, concerns, the cultural concerns of the project on their territory. And so those get woven in to the discussion and the negotiation about how the project will proceed. And I just think it's fantastic. And and I was saying this last night, they've been to Washington a couple of times, and let me tell you, their dance card is full. Government, private sector, on the Hill, at the White House, everyone wants to talk to them because they are really, at least in our country, doing something quite new, powerful, and important. And I think others are looking to that for some example.
Ambassador Valdés, how about you? What do you think about this issue? Obviously, there are some serious environmental concerns with this kind of mineral development. What balance are you aiming to strike there?
We have, as you know, accepted the invitation of the United States to participate in this project called APEP. The Association for Progress in the Americas. Latin America is together a group of countries that is extremely different from one from the other. The level of developments of the countries that have been invited is also very different. The type of requests that are included in that proposal are requests that try to pave the way for good investments in the region. We understand very well that and you all know the important openings that Chinese investments have had in Latin America during the last 20 years. Therefore, I understand that the proposal has a lot to do with the idea of incorporating Latin American countries into a discussion on development that will allow us to receive Western countries' investments in a better form. in a more competitive form. That's okay, but as I said before, the differences between these countries is enormous. And then we want very much to cooperate with the United States, but we have to understand very well the way in which this is operationalized, because it's not clear how this will be operationalized. We want to cooperate with Honduras, but it's clear that the situation in Honduras is not the situation in Chile or the situation in Colombia. Second thing, the Inflation Reduction Act. Unfortunately, we don't have an organization like the European Union in Latin America. Therefore, we do not have the possibility of having a discussion with the United States in which they will clarify to us exactly what means to be or not to be in the Inflation Reduction Act. What we see in Latin America, and we are not clear that we understand exactly all the consequences of the Inflation Reduction Act, is that we might be facing competition in some areas due to the subsidies that the United States is going to provide to its companies. And this concerns us. This is not a matter that we would like to leave aside. We would like to discuss that. In this context, the type of investments we want is the type of investments that, first of all, go to our wealth. We produce 26% of the copper that is consumed in the world. And the need for copper will only increase in the next 20 years. We already said something about the lithium and other rare earth and other minerals. We want investments that will respect the environment, of course, and will comply with Chilean established laws on the environment, which I have to say are the result, most of it, of our agreement with Canada 20 years or 30 years ago. I don't remember. I was a negotiator. I was a trade negotiator at the time of Chile, but I don't remember the date now. And also with the European Union, with which we have an extraordinarily important trade agreement. The US trade agreement also includes requisites and demands in the matters of environment and labor. Therefore, the laws in Chile are very much in the same tone of what is established in these countries. Second thing we want is to try to absorb investments that will bring with them a certain development of industrial capacity along the idea of lithium. We are not talking about batteries necessarily, but we are talking about other processes that are previous to batteries that we would like to develop a capacity in Chile, and we have the people to do that. We had been a mining country since our foundation. Therefore, we have an enormous amount of people who are very well prepared to work on that. And third, we want that these investments consider the opinion of the local communities, which are extremely important to us, and that have become extremely important to us recently in the last years. And they have opinions on what it means to exploit lithium in the salars of the north of Chile, particularly, Salar de Atacama and the others, which are blessed by nature but need a lot of water and have the need for a complete participation of the communities in them. This is what I could say. Thank you.
Great. I wanted to actually ask you, I'm glad you bring up the Biden administration America's framework. It's the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, or APEP. I was curious about your thoughts on that, because Chile is a very open country. You have many FTAs around the world. Do you think that this new framework, APEP, can play a role in the critical minerals sector, or do you see these other, more binding kind of trade agreements that you have as more sort of influential?
We have been discussing with our friends here in Washington what is the relationship between APEP and having a free trade agreement. Mm-hmm. There is a link there that it's not clear right now, but it's evident that. It's evident that if we are going to participate in tables, as you know, the organization of the debate will be around tables on subjects. One of the subjects is energy, one of the subjects is electricity, one of the subjects is the development of minerals, strategic minerals. Therefore, we are going to be there, and we are going to discuss in this table with other countries of Latin America, probably Argentina, the situation with the US government. We are absolutely prepared to do that. But we are also prepared to cooperate with the United States in the development of other countries that have serious problems in other areas in which we have managed to solve problems. The judiciary, the way in which the controller's office works, things that the United States and other countries need in Latin America in order to invest.
And while we're on the subject of trade frameworks, maybe I could just ask Ambassador Hillman really quickly. Was there a discussion of Canada joining the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework last week, the Biden administration's framework for Asia? And do you see that framework as a potential shaper of critical mineral arrangements globally?
So yes, there was a discussion about it. The U.S. has already expressed their support for Canada to join IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And Secretary Blinken, I forget when it was a couple of months ago, expressed that publicly in Canada, and the Prime Minister and the President discussed it as well. There's a process. There are other members, so there's a process for that to take place. I think one of the there's many interesting things about that arrangement, but I think one of the things that's going to be most interesting is the standard setting discussion. So it kind of goes back to my earlier comment around standards and how like-minded countries, as we move forward to try and inject certain values in our trade that bring us together as allies, that define who's, in the world of friendshoring, that define kind of who's a friend and who isn't and why. A lot of that's around standards, labor standards, environmental standards, human rights standards, community standards. And IPEF is going to talk a little bit about that. So that, I think, is going to be really interesting. If it gets to really meaty and serious, I think that could be a very interesting discussion and will absolutely have an effect on critical minerals and all other green technologies and products.
And do you think Canada is interested in joining that?
We'd be interested in joining it for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'll go back to Mr. Nohara. What about your thoughts on the Japanese approach toward, this balance that we were talking about earlier of, encouraging responsible production, environmental protections, any, models that you see working particularly well in that space, and how is that discussion evolving in Japan?
Yeah. Sustainability of the battery supply chains is important, needless to say. And my view is we need some concrete flagship projects which promote sustainability of battery supply chains. Japan is now working on the carbon footprint, also the due diligence of supply chains, our data exchange platform. And we can join some global discussion how we can improve interoperability, also standardization of the projects which individual country or region might already work on. So I would like to touch on one example. Japan raised and start discussion about carbon footprint standardization of batteries for industrial use at International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC. Yeah, so this is one example I would like to touch on. Yeah.
And did you have any more thoughts you wanted to share on, how you think countries should kind of break free of their dependence on specific countries in the battery supply chain? So, breaking free of a dependence on China, what does that partnership look like?
Yeah, my view, so we need a kind of a broader coalition. Otherwise, if the like-minded countries fall into two groups, the one group is taking action area, the other groups is not taking action for a while. So the producing countries will export heavily to the latter group and at the lower price. So the latter group might be increased dependency on the specific countries. So it's hard for them to join the like-minded countries. They might drop off the like-minded groups. So we need broader coalition to deal with this issue, how to cut or reduce dependency, over-dependency on specific producing countries or suppliers.
And Vice Chair Asimakopolou, I'll go back to you. That is an interesting point. I mean, a lot of America's close allies are sort of net consuming countries, and it seems like some of the frameworks that are being discussed so far, I know there was some discussion in the G7 of sort of a critical mineral buyers club. How do you see that evolving, and at what point do you think the United States and Europe and other sort of major G7 powers kind of need to engage more with producing countries? And maybe along with that, we were talking earlier about some sustainability, environmental standards. Obviously that's a big tension there. How does that go forward?
Let me just pick up on the point that Her Excellency raised before. Europe has set as its top goals, the European Union, this green transition and digital transition. And I think that people are now, your average person in Europe is just now coming to understand the importance of critical raw materials for this transition, especially the green transition. I don't think most people understand, what a battery needs. Most people don't understand what a wind turbine needs. So, and as the ambassador said before, we've all kind of been turning a blind eye and being, frankly, a bit hypocritical about the fact that, yes, we're trying to reduce our own carbon footprint, but we're not looking at where these things are being produced, and we're not looking at the carbon footprint of their production there. We're not looking at, labor standards there. We're not looking at any environmental concerns there. So this idea of a critical raw materials club, or whatever you want to call it, I think is a threefold response. One, yes, we want to bring together all these like-minded partners, and I think if there's something that we've all come together on this panel is, yes, we have a shared set of values, and we have a shared set of goals, and we want to work together as opposed to the rest of the world, and we don't want to be dependent on other systems that have different characteristics. So that's one thing. And I think that we also need to change our approach. The discussion that Europe was this colonial power that would just go to a country and take everything and leave is way past. It's not going to be acceptable at all at the level of the European Union. So we're talking now about partnerships and about engaging locally and about making sure that the local population has benefits, and making sure that these value chains and that processing is developed in these countries. So it's a totally different discussion, and these partnerships are paying off. We're very much looking forward to these free trade agreements with Chile, with Australia, with Indonesia. And I have to tell you that when we're talking about these trade relationships and these partnerships, these strategic partnerships, we're not just talking about, let's say, offense, getting them done. We're talking about defense too. Somebody mentioned in a previous panel that China had at some point put an export ban on rare earths. Indonesia has done the same thing for nickel, for example, and is now discussing doing it again. So, we just last night at 4 a.m. in the European Union came up with an agreement on principle on this legislation called the anti-coercion instrument, which allows us to take measures against countries that are weaponizing trade. And you better believe they're going to weaponize critical raw materials. Unquestionably, this is going to be the next big weapon of choice, and we're going to see this. And I think that the EU having, made this step is very important. So this club can leverage its power and its, cooperation to also stop dealing with coercive behavior from wherever that might come from, which could be very dangerous and very difficult geopolitically and in many other respects. So.
We have just a couple minutes left. Did you want to share some more thoughts? You mentioned a subsidy race earlier, and you know, I'm curious what you think should be done to discourage that kind of zero-sum competition. You know, of course, at the end of the day, countries are also still competing for these companies to come and,
of course.
You know, so.
Of course, but we also
really
don't want to, you know, we also don't want companies to just forum shop. I mean, you know, there is that delicate line where you want to encourage competition and innovation. Yes, you want to protect your own national security, but at the same time, you know, you don't want to create these disincentives and just have companies shopping, and, you know, you want the free market to work too, and this hasn't changed in Europe. That's what we want. Yes, we want to develop our own industry, but as I said before, you know, this doesn't have to be viewed like that. It has to be viewed in the larger geopolitical context. And in the larger geopolitical context, we're better off working together for a variety of reasons. And that includes benefits to our companies, benefits to our countries, benefits to democracy, and, you know, fighting the good fight together. And I never thought critical raw materials would play such an important role, but it does. It does, and it will continue to in the coming years.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just, I think that it's interesting because we are talking about a group of products that have an economic value and obviously a technological value. But the technological value isn't just for the green transition. It's also truly a security question, an energy and economic security question, but a national security question for all of our countries. And at the national security level, our countries are used to working together, yes, to do as best we can for ourselves, but also in partnership for the strength of the greater partnership. And I think that's a paradigm that is starting to be overlaid on this particular economic discussion. It doesn't happen everywhere. I mean, there may be other areas where we're just going to try and, you know, outcompete each other because that's the way free markets work. But sometimes the particular context in which you're working and the grouping of products in which you're working are not just about, you know, building great new cars, which of course this is about, and that's fantastic, but that's not just what it's about, these raw materials. And I do feel that in the conversations that I have been in, up to those that my Prime Minister is having, they are informed by the geostrategic and like hard security reality of this group of products. And that makes the sort of cooperation element have quite a different tone to it.
Mm-hmm. That's a refrain we're hearing more and more these days, that economic security is national security, and it seems like we're not going to stop hearing that anytime soon. So, well, I thank you all. That was a really interesting panel. Thanks so much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.